Welcome to day 2 of the XTC 2020 Global Competition Bootcamp. Thank you all for joining us from all over the world. My name is Rajiv Rajan. I am the Chief of Staff and Head of Marketing and Communications for the Samsung Strategy and Innovation Center. I am also a member of the XTC management team, and I will be your host for today. Please join me in welcoming Neesha Tambe from TechCrunch. Neesha is the Startup Battlefield editor and head of community for TechCrunch. Neesha currently runs Startup Battlefield, TechCrunch's global startup launch competition in Berlin, San Francisco, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Akin to the in-house VC, Neesha manages the sourcing, vetting, and training of teams for Startup Battlefield, as well as TechCrunch top picks. Additionally, she co-manages TechCrunch's Inclusive Diversity Initiative and founded Crunch Match, TechCrunch's investor startup matching program. Prior to working at TechCrunch, Neesha ran a sustainability and shared values startup competition for sustainable brands and worked in various government-related roles. Outside of work, Neesha is the Parks and Recreations Commissioner for the city of Cupertino. She likes to bake bread and spends endless hours with her fierce feminist 4-year-old niece. So her talk today is going to be how to and how not to engage with the press. So please join me in welcoming Neesha. Take us away.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. It's been a crazy time in the world, so I appreciate everybody here taking a moment to learn about how to engage with press and the best practices. Before we get going, I did want to take a moment to make sure that if you have any notebooks or pens and things like that, you go ahead and take them out. Sometimes it's better to use the screen just to focus and then have a pen and a paper to actually take your notes. It's also a way that you will learn better and that information will retain. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So just give me a moment. Fantastic. So as was mentioned, again, my name is Neesha Tambe. I'm the Startup Battlefield editor and the head of community for TechCrunch. Just as a little bit of background about Startup Battlefield. Startup Battlefield is TechCrunch's startup launch competition. To qualify for the competition, companies should be early stage, pre-launch, have at least an MVP with limited press. We are industry agnostic, so that means that we work with companies in biotech to CPG to enterprise to space across the board. We also have we're also geography agnostic. So for our Disrupt that's happening this fall, we accept companies from all over the world because innovation doesn't just happen in the Silicon Valley, it happens all over the world. We've had over 902 companies participate so far. We've had 115 exits, so that's either IPOs or acquisitions. And our companies have raised a total of $9.1 billion in funding. If we were allowed to invest, because we are a media company, we cannot invest in the companies that we select, but if we were, we would perform in the top quartile VC worldwide. Now, what you guys are all here for, which is how to pitch to press. Pitching to press can be scary, it can be frustrating, but it can also be incredibly rewarding. So today is intended to be an overview of the things that you're going to need to know as you're pitching to press, what not to do, and what to do. This will be your primer. As I mentioned, it's going to go over some of the key terms, some of the key approaches that you should be taking, and things that you'll need to prepare. But of course, there are always details and nuances. There'll be a time for Q&A at the end where you can ask some questions. So please do write them down and keep them in mind as we continue. We'll be covering primarily 4 sections: prerequisites, preparation, positioning, and purpose. These are the 4 things that you'll need to effectively work with the press as you proceed. Prerequisites. Here are just a few of the terms that you need to know when you're working with press. Anytime you are talking to a member of press, assume that you are on the record. I am starting from the beginning with a couple of these words because I do know that we have a really global cohort today, which is very exciting. So I do want to make sure for those folks who aren't as familiar, I'm going to go through a couple of these words. On the record essentially means that whatever you say whenever you're talking to a press person, they can use in an article, they can quote you, and it's fair game. You are always on the record unless you specifically say that you are off the record. If you do not say you are off the record and get a confirmation that you are off the record, then they can use whatever you say. Most of the times it can be frustrating for a writer to get, hey, here's something off the record. You can't write about it ever, but I'm just going to tell you all these interesting facts. So be very judicious about how often you say off the record with people. Assume that you're always on the record and act like it. The second is embargoes. What is an embargo? An embargo is basically a time where your article will go live or that information can be publicly shared. So for example, if I were making a news announcement and I was not ready for it to go live to the public until July 1st, I would say, this is the information, the embargo date is July 1st. Critically, make sure you add in the time zone. I have seen this happen a lot where people will give a date and a time, but they will not include the time zone of the place that they are from or the place that they are engaging, the place that the writer is from. And that actually makes it very difficult for the writer. The writer will typically just go with the time zone that is the standard for their publication. So do include the time zone. An NDA. It's a non-disclosure agreement, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. Why does it apply in the press sphere? Press understand that there are some things that they cannot legally disclose in advance of an embargo, or they're being given a private tour of a facility that they might not be able to, for legal reasons, write about. It is possible to get a writer to sign an NDA. However, it is very rare that somebody will sign an NDA for something that does not require it. So things like, very intense pharmaceutical developments might require an NDA. Things that involve government parties might require an NDA. Things that discuss military or national or international security. Those are types of things that might require NDAs. And that's okay. If you are legally required to have everybody who interacts with your company have an NDA, and then you can approve certain things out of it, that's fine. An NDA, however, does not mean that you can control what the writer writes. So you don't necessarily get approval on what the writer will publish or the journalist will publish. It simply means that they cannot disclose specific things from their tour or from the interview that you have. An exclusive is where you say, okay, this publication is the only publication I'm talking to. That will increase the currency of your story. A journalist is more likely to report on something that has an exclusive because they know they're the only ones that are going to be talking to you. It is possible after an exclusive is written for you to share your news with other news outlets, but it's always that what you're committing to talk to only one person or only one news organization. And then once that article is launched, you can line up and or have other publications share your information. But an exclusive is a really great way to catch people's attention. Press releases, most of you are familiar with press releases, but this is comprehensive information about your company, about the launch, and about any news that is related to the article that you are hoping will get written. Multiple sources and tips. So if you are pitching to a writer, or a journalist, it is their responsibility to do due diligence on your company as well. If you say you have 1 million ARR and you have 30 customers and you give an example of a customer, many times a journalist will actually follow up with the tips and or the relationships that you say that you have. So make sure that when you're talking to a journalist or a writer that you are being transparent and clear, which we'll get into a little bit later. They will often have multiple sources in a piece that they write. It's just good journalism. So make sure that you have kept everything buttoned up within your company and also with the partners that you're working with. Earned media. Now this is really important. Earned media is a built relationship with a writer, or a journalist. A built relationship basically means that you have connected with them so that you're not simply asking them for, you're not doing a cold email and saying, hi, my name is, it's nice to meet you, here's some information. Earned media is actually where you've built and developed a relationship with a writer, which we'll go into a little bit later on how to do. And that is actually one of the best ways to make sure that you will get coverage, or you will at least have a chance at getting coverage. And the final thing is the comms channel, which we'll also dive into later. The communications channel is essentially knowing who in your company is going to be talking to press. If there are 4 people at your company, know the one person who's going to be primarily responsible, especially as your company grows and scales. This is critical. It's important to make sure that your team knows that if there is an external person asking questions about your company, that those people within your company will funnel those questions to the right communications person. Establishing that comms channel is super important because it will help you stay on message. Also, typically as the leaders of the company, you have a bird's eye view of everything that's happening that, as you grow to 100 people, maybe, one person might not necessarily be aware of. And so you want to make sure that you are centralizing the external communications for your company. Preparation, selecting a news outlet. This is one of my favorite sections because people tend to think that, oh, I have news, so I want to share it with 100 different news outlets, and it's going to be great to get every single news outlet to cover my company. Not the case. In fact, if a writer gets a form email from you where it's very clear that it's not tailored to that person, they're much less likely to actually engage with what you're pitching to them. It's really important to understand news versus tech news, and by that I mean it's not just about big names. Understand which news outlets or which publications are most useful to your industry. And then depending on where you are in your scaling process, you can change the kinds of companies or the kinds of publications that you pitch to. If you are a biotech company, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going to Teen Vogue as your first point of, publication. However, as you scale, maybe Fortune is the right pitch for you, or maybe TechCrunch is the right pitch for you. So you have to actually find and do research on these things rather than just selecting the ones that have big names or saying, oh, it's the Wall Street Journal, therefore I must. If you are a startup company, it's also important to make sure you're finding something, especially in the beginning, that has a startup focus or that shows that they have startup coverage. Even in things like the Times or in Wall Street Journal or in Fortune or in all these other major publications, make sure that you're focusing on contacting the right person, not just sending a general email to the entire news org or tweeting at everybody. That also does not work. Please don't do that. I actually had I had interacted with a startup who had tweeted at every single person who worked at TechCrunch. Needless to say, we did not end up covering that company, but make sure you're doing your homework. The second is the global and regional impact. This part is particularly important. Know where you are in your scaling. If you are just starting out and you are a country that is or you are a company that is in Berlin, and your product is about infrastructure development in Berlin, it doesn't make sense to necessarily have an article in a US publication. That just doesn't make sense, since it's not going to bring in what you want from all of this. Start regional, start industry, and then go global and broader publication. Writer relationships. What are some ways that you can actually start developing these relationships with writers? Typically, as you are building product, that's a really great time to engage with writers. You can also engage with the things that they've written in the past. If you've done your research, which you should be able to tell which writer at a company writes about your industry. Read their work. If you haven't read the work of the writer that you're targeting, then it's probably not the right writer. You should also know, so the other things that you can do to develop writer relationships, if you have a happy hour, you can invite them to that. Again, remember that everything that happens is on the record unless otherwise indicated, so you want to be mindful of that. Engaging with their posts, you can send them an email introducing your company before you launch it. That's also okay. The reason that you want to develop these relationships with writers and make sure that you're connected with them again is that it gives you a higher chance of being covered instead of just sending off a cold email. Know your dates. I've gotten a lot of messages from companies where they're like, oh, actually, I need to change my embargo date, or I need to change this, I need to change that. Know your dates before you go in, and also know how to prepare for that. So if you need an article, if you're looking to have an article published on July 1st, you should be talking to the writer now, because you need to give them lead time to say yes or no. If it doesn't work out, you need to move on to another person, giving yourself some buffer time. And then you also need to give the writer buffer time, especially right now between COVID. If you're trying to pitch to somebody in the United States, between all of the racial injustice issues that are happening, it is taking writers and reporters more time to get back to companies that are doing more standard, more like traditional announcements. And so make sure that you're opting in for that lead time. Know the type of coverage that you want. Are you doing this so that you get customers? Are you doing this to support a future round? Are you doing this just for publicity's sake? Understand what type of coverage you're looking for, and that also will help you decide which writer and which kind of outlet you decide to select. The final thing is make sure you have your press kit ready. So a press kit is not just your press release. It is the story that you're trying to pitch. It's your company boilerplate. So that is all of the relevant information to your company, your team info, your company info, investor or background information. Try to be as clear as possible in all of these elements. Quotes if relevant, and with credit. So by with credit, I mean, if somebody has taken a photo of your product, give them credit. It's important legally for publications as well to be able to provide credit for images, and oftentimes that doesn't happen. If you guys own your own, then typically that's fine, but you should still always credit photographers as well when you are adding that material to your press kit. If you have demo videos, this is a great place to add a demo video. You want to basically create a packet of information where the writer, when they talk to you and when they interview you, will actually have solid questions to ask rather than just tell me more about your company. So this will give them a head start as well. 10 more minutes before Q&A. Okay, so for positioning, in terms of its outreach timing, core objectives, lead, and formatting. We'll start from the bottom, formatting. Your email to a writer should not and should never be your press release. Those are long, they are often boring. Make sure that you are focusing the formatting of your email in what is newsworthy. Today we are launching, we're providing TechCrunch. We would like to give a TechCrunch exclusive for, our product launch or for our international product launch. This is why it's newsworthy. Actually put in bullet points and succinct bullet points why it's actually newsworthy. Don't make the writer or the reporter sift through tons of information to actually get to the meat of it. Tell them upfront what's interesting about it. Know who is the lead for your project. So smaller companies, typically that's your CEO. Depending on the publication, you either send the CMO, COO, or CTO. For TechCrunch, we typically like the more technical side of things. So that would be your CTO if your CEO can't, but when you're early, your CEO. Eventually, when you hit scale, you're going to want to look for a PR firm to help you manage. It just becomes very overwhelming, and it's nice to have another arm that can help you. However, you should still make sure that your CEO or your senior leadership at your company is very intimately involved until you're the point where you can no longer, interact with press at all, which is typically not an early stage company. But if you get to, Series B, that's typically the time where you would opt in for PR unless you're getting a lot of attention or dealing with sensitive subject matter. So if it's something that has, HIPAA regulations or some kind of there's a governed body or overseeing the innovation that you've made, that might actually be a time to tap in a PR person who's an expert in your industry, because they will be aware of what to share, what not to share, and what can get you in trouble. Your core objective, again, make sure that you understand why you're doing this, what you're doing this for. Timing, understand the landscape of the ecosystem that you're going in. Right now, it's COVID. If you have a travel startup, pitching a travel startup in this market is hard. Make sure that you're bringing in an angle that is relevant to what is happening right now so that you're keeping your startup on that forefront. And then finally, as I mentioned before, outreach, which is not just targeting one news outlet, understanding what the cadence of your communication is. It's possible that you don't give, or you don't want to give an exclusive to everyone, but you are sharing information and pitching to various news outlets. That's totally fine. Just understand and have this mapped out so you know who is working with you, who needs quotes, and who needs all of your information. The purpose, your story, clarity, honest connection, and follow-up. The best way to get coverage is to make sure that it's something that's interesting. Vanity metrics are not interesting. Oh, today we got, our 100th customer. That's very exciting for you guys. That's very exciting for your investors and for your family and for your friends. That is not something most people open up the newspaper to read about a company getting their 100th customer. So doesn't mean you don't celebrate, it just means it's not necessarily the best for a story. If you hired somebody on as your new president, okay, great. You hired somebody on as your new president, not necessarily the most interesting of news. However, if you hired on, your new president was C-suite at one of the FANG companies, absolutely something that you want news about. That will be very interesting for people to read and follow. If it is a person who has a big following in your industry, also something that might be considered for a story. And then if the founder themselves or if the senior leadership teams themselves have an interesting story, that can also be a different angle. But the story itself should be something that it communicates a message around whatever the news is. If you're launching a product, that's excellent, that's very exciting. But what is the importance of that? What is the significance? What is the thing that is going to make somebody who reads that headline actually want to continue reading the rest of that article? So framing your achievement and framing your news or your launch in a story fashion is going to be very important in terms of getting the attention of both the journalist as well as the attention of the audience of that specific publication. Clarity, be clear, be concise, don't bullshit, be honest. I know it is difficult to sometimes, admit when you aren't sure of something. You don't always have to answer a question that a journalist asks. That is also how not to engage with press. If you don't know an answer to something, or if you are uncomfortable or unable to answer a question, it's okay to just not answer that question. You can say, thank you for that question, and then either focus on something else or just say, thank you for that question. We'll circle back with you on that. The reason is, there's a lot of times where startups are still figuring out what they're doing in specific arenas. If you don't know, don't say. And if it's something that you shouldn't be sharing, don't share it. I have recommended to a lot of companies that they write down a bullet point list of things that they are allowed to talk about with a journalist, because sometimes, and if a journalist is very good, you might get caught up in conversation and you might bond with them, you might have a great rapport with them, and all of a sudden they'll slide in a question and you won't even realize that they're trying to dig into a specific angle of your company. Now, that doesn't mean all writers will do this. It's not that they're out to get you, but they want to know what the story is behind something. It's also okay to have news that isn't always positive. So say, your company has had to lay off people. Sometimes it is important to control the narrative about not so positive things that are happening with your company. It's not just about, here's the shiny new thing that's happening with my business. Sometimes there are struggles. Sometimes there are things that are hard, and it's okay to control that narrative. It is much better to control the narrative than to have somebody email in a tip and then a writer reaches out to you for comment, because then you're blindsided. It's also important to have a good connection, as I mentioned, with both the writer and the audience, and then follow up. Follow up is very important. Sending a thank you note. You don't really have to send gifts. Writers aren't allowed to accept presents. there are ethics rules around that. But following up even with a simple thank you in an email format, very helpful. Don't follow up by putting them on your generic newsletter. Oh my goodness, not exciting. They will get, if they got on the newsletters of every single company they ever wrote about, their inboxes would just be impossible. They're already impossible, so please don't do that. But follow up with them with an actual crafted direct email. Again, exclusives are, I know we only have a few minutes left before we jump into the Q&A and a little exercise I have for you guys. So the exclusives portion of this, like I mentioned, it is one of the best ways to get coverage is to commit to an exclusive, but know when you say you're giving an exclusive that it means that you're not going to do an interview with another organization, or that company has first reporting rights before other people. It is not necessarily the best tactic to use depending on what you're trying to launch or what news you're trying to share. However, it is a good way to get interest from writers. But if you say it's an exclusive, you need to honor that. And if you don't, it sours relationships not only with the reporters themselves, but it also sours the relationship with the entire press outlet, because the writers do talk to each other. CEOs hustle. So I love that. I think that CEOs really should be involved, especially in the beginning and as you do major things for the company. Limit the PR interference at the start. Unless you have, like I mentioned, something that's really sensitive, having a conversation between the CEO and the writer is the most authentic way and the most interesting thing for a journalist. However, if you have not done, basic media training, which now you've gotten basic media training, but additionally, if you are not comfortable talking to someone, or if you continuously find that you're accidentally saying things that you shouldn't be sharing, maybe you are not the person to do that. If that is the case, you can get a PR person on board or share the load with somebody on your team who is better suited and better equipped to be working with the press. How do you pick your PR agency? You can pick from your founder network. Typically, founders are good about referring good PR agencies. You can also talk to your investors. Investors typically have PR agencies in their Rolodex that they can share with you. And that's always a good place to start, is really use your resources for that. Show that this matters. So make sure that there's always a leadership person from your company on any emails that go towards a press person. You should always, always, always have visibility in terms of what is being communicated from your company to the press. And then persistence is key, but take a hint. What does that mean? Writers get a lot of emails regularly, and their inboxes are flooded. You send an email one time, they might not see it. You tweet at them one time, they might not see it. Follow up. Follow-ups are important. One of the reasons you want to develop a relationship with a writer is so that if they see your name or if they see your company, they're more likely to click into it. However, if you are consistently tweeting at them every single day for 365 days, that's not going to go over well. However, if you send them, a second tweet, or a second DM, or if you send them a second email, then that often will be something that they might follow up with. Persistence is key. It is important to follow up. It is important to continuously reach out, because it's just the inbound is really hard. Don't take rejection from a writer as a metric for whether or not your company is going to be successful. That is just not the case. Learn to distinguish rejection about a press piece and evaluation of your company. Does not necessarily equate to the same thing. Now, if you've done over 100 outreaches to press, it might be time to change your tactics and change the foot that you're putting forward, or recraft the story, the messaging that I had spoken about earlier, away from, if you were focusing on, industry first, maybe you need to focus on the problem and the setup instead as you're pitching your company. Press releases suck, so please don't put them as your entire email. It's great information, necessary information to put within an email, in your press packet, in your press kit, but don't just copy and paste that into an email. It's not going to get the attention of the writer or the journalist. It's a lot of information to sift through, but do provide the information so that if they're excited by the information that you're sharing, the bullet points or the very concise newsworthy story that you share in your email, then they can get the background in the press release that's attached. Again, emails should be direct, emphasize why it's interesting, include supplemental information, and pick the right writer. If your writer covers sustainability and you're a sustainability company, excellent. But if the writer that you're targeting, or if the writer that your PR firm has a relationship with exclusively writes about SaaS and enterprise and your product has nothing to do with that, not the right writer, you're not going to get going to even get a response, or a good response at that. As you're scaling, your approach to press should change. As I mentioned before, the news outlets that you focus on can change as well. Maybe you don't focus on regional and industry-specific publications anymore. You'll scale that to things that are more international. This is a lot around timing. So if you're looking, typically people don't actually announce their raises right away. They'll wait a little bit and they'll use that as a springboard for a next raise. That's very common. But understand like when and why you're doing that. You're trying to pitch that article. As your company grows, you might need PR. You want to make sure really clearly that you're centralizing communications throughout your company. And also, keep in mind that you should still maintain relationships with people who wrote your first article, even if they might be a smaller publication or a more niche publication. The idea that you can continue that relationship with them. TechCrunch likes to cover companies from ideation and launch to exit. And sometimes we'll follow a founder after they've exited as well to see where what they're doing, what new company they've started, etc. So, we cover the gamut of companies, though we do have an emphasis on early stage, but we do cover later stage as well, especially if we have a relationship with the company or it's an announcement of significance. International markets. So if you are a company that is not based in the United States, right now, during COVID, it is nearly impossible for you to make a trip over. Otherwise, I would have said, come to the US and actually do a meet and greet tour with people. The other thing is, because that's not something that's available right now, use your resources. Get introductions from founder friends of yours, get introductions from people who organize your accelerator, get introductions from your investors. Introductions are a really great way to connect with a journalist or a writer at a publication, and especially if you are in an international market, having these additional points of contact is going to be really important if you're looking at US coverage and you're not based in the US. If English is not your first language, I would highly recommend that you have somebody on your team who can either proofread or also just be a support person for you in that area. You can also, make sure that you're targeting people who cover your region as well. And finally, it's okay to not get coverage in the US. Not having coverage in the US does not mean your company is going to fail. There are more than enough companies that are international that have done incredible things in the geographies that they're in, and they don't actually need the Silicon Valley to be successful. So know what those news organizations are in your area that can take your company to the next level. The small ones, as I had mentioned, the more niche ones are industry specific, and then the broader countrywide or geography wide. If you have a market that is very large that's near you, say for example, you might be launching something in China, their press system is very different. Know what things that they are allowed to and not allowed to say. If you are trying to launch in different areas, make sure that you are clear about what the expectations are of different regions and what they will actually allow to be published. It is possible that some companies are just not going to get coverage in conservative countries because of the nature of that product. It's also possible for countries to monitor what is being published. Be very cognizant about what relationship each country has to press, so that you're not wasting time on countries that wouldn't publish anyways. But you do want to make sure that you are focusing on ecosystems and press outlets that are relevant to your product and relevant to the geographies that you're speaking in, that you're launching in. You are always pitching. What does that mean? Always, 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 you are pitching. It doesn't matter if you are talking to your best friend. It doesn't matter if you are at a birthday party for somebody. You are always pitching. Why do I say this? You never know when there's going to be a journalist. I'm not trying to make you all scared and, never talk about the business you're doing, because it's great that you are, but know what your talking points are. Know the things that you are going to regularly share and that are okay to be shared publicly, and stick to those. Everybody in the world does not need to know all the details and the nitty-gritty and the growth path of your company. Create a list of things that you're comfortable sharing with people, and share that with the rest of your company as well. Especially as you get bigger, you want to make sure that you're centralizing any kind of external communication, but you are always pitching. If you are at a club, or if you're at a private social club, or if you are at a grocery store, or if you're at an event and somebody overhears something, if it's not off the record explicitly, then it is on the record, and they can incorporate that into a conversation or into an article.
Neesha,
You're always pitching.
Neesha, this is Rajiv. We have about 7 minutes left in your talk, and we have got one question. Sujay, you have a question? Please introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Neesha. I'm Sujay from Lilu. Of course, like we've met before. My question is more about, so when you're first pitching to a writer or a journalist, and it's your first email, how much information is too much information in that first pitch email? Like when, for instance, like if you're close around and you're raising around to build something really innovative and really cool, and you think it's newsworthy, like how much information do you provide there? Like, do you actually go in and say, okay, like these are the investors and XX amount has been raised from XX people, or like how much is too much? And then what is gonna be the pitch actually? Is it gonna be, okay, like I'd love to sort of get on a phone call with you and discuss more, or like what exactly is the pitch going to be?
Excellent, great question. It does vary based off of publication and writer style. However, typically in that initial email, you should share your news, but you don't necessarily have to share all of the details. So for example, if you have raised a round from Sequoia, which is pretty significant, you can say like, we have raised our Series B or our Series A from one of the top 3 global VC. So you're giving them enough of a teaser so that they will respond to you. Yeah. If you have a pre-existing relationship with the writer, if you've done your preparation work and you've actually interacted with them in some capacity, or if they're a warm introduction, you can say, this is embargoed until X date, and provide a little bit more information about your raise. It's a fine line between sharing information to make sure that they are interested and they want to write, and oversharing information. If you say that something is embargoed for a specific date, time, and time zone, it is the mark of a terrible writer or a terrible journalist if they publish anything related to that before that embargo time. That happens it has happened, but it happens very rarely. That is just not what journalists are supposed to do. I would say if you are doing a really big round that has a lot of details, so there's, you have really top people coming in, I would say give them a little snippet. If they respond, then follow up with the details. If they don't respond, then maybe that's the time that you follow up with the additional information, but always make sure to include an embargo date, time, and time zone, so that you know that you have basically banded the information that you are sharing. You can also actually say, off the record, and then provide additional details as well. I typically like to encourage companies to have at least one or two one email exchange confirming that something is off the record before saying it, but you can also in an email say, here's public information, and then off the record here, is this of interest to you? If it is, we can share additional details and exclusive or whatever it is that you're planning on giving to them.
Got it. Thank you.
We got a question from KK. So he asks, we are a social enterprise and sometimes journalists mention us in articles without reaching out. Is there an easy way to contact them to follow up on those articles and provide an update?
Great. That's a great question. And yes, there are a number of ways that you can follow up with them. If the person is active on a specific social media outlet, so say, for example, they wrote about you in an article and it was on Twitter, retweeting them, tagging them and saying, thank you for, including us in XYZ. Giving some sort of engagement point is really important, and showing them that they've already got interest in you, and then you saw that and you recognized it. It's kind of a multi-step thing. So responding to the pitch that they responding to the article that they included you in on a various social media channel, and then sending them a direct email, citing the work that they wrote about. A lot of times people will just send an email being like, oh, thank you for the coverage. And that's very generic. But if you say, oh, I appreciate, in this section of your work, you talked about XYZ, and then go into, it looks to me like, or by reading the rest of your work, writers love it when it's clear that you've paid attention to them, they love it when you've paid attention to them. And so when you share that with them, it's more likely to get a response, and they're likely to follow up with you as well. If you don't have their email, social media, really great way of reaching out to people. Also, if you go onto a media company's website, you will often find the emails of the writers there. Journalists are actively looking for sources all the time. There are various online sources that you can use to actually scrape data. I don't personally enjoy those because I get a lot of random emails and phone calls, but there are online resources where you can scrape for that information. But in terms of email, you can typically find that on the website, or almost every news outlet. Actually, I don't know of a news outlet that doesn't have listed email addresses, but all media companies will have a standardized email. So if you send something at info and then you get a response from someone, you'll actually be able to tell, is it first name dot last name, or is it first name dot, or is it first letter and then last name? But you can kind of glean from that way. The other trick, which I used to do a lot, is in the to column, you put one iteration of a potential email, and in the BCC column, you put several iterations of that potential email. Is actually a hack. And it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's the most sophisticated way of doing it, but it does get the job done if you're trying to reach out to somebody, and you'll typically be able to get that back. But LinkedIn is a great avenue, and Twitter is also a great avenue, depending on the company.
Well, thank you, Neesha. I think we're right at the top of the hour. And that was a fantastic talk, by the way. The range of information that you covered was amazing. I know in your last slide, you had contact information. So if anybody wants to contact you after this chat, what is the best way to do that?
Via email. So my email is Neesha, Neesha at TechCrunch.com. And just as parting words, working with press can be challenging, but it is also extremely rewarding. And so an opportunity for these journalists to highlight the things that you've been doing is equally as excellent for the journalists as it is for you. So I really appreciate you guys giving me some time to chat with you. And again, happy to answer questions that you might have, and my email's in the chat now too. Thanks, Barrett.